Today, I want to break down a recent movie that I watched, and that is Conclave. Because when I was watching this movie, I was just blown away by how visually compelling this movie was. And I personally think it should have won Best Cinematography at the Oscars, but we won't get into that. So today, I just want to highlight some of the techniques that were kind of used in this movie, because it wasn't just the lighting that made the cinematography so good in this film. So I want to go through, a few of the frames and a few of the scenes in this movie, and break them down to show and highlight why I think they just look so good. Because when I was watching this movie, I just felt like most of the shots were just so simple and so beautiful. And let's just get right into it, because I think the first scene here that I want to talk about really highlights the simplicity and the beauty of the whole movie. Okay, so this is a very iconic scene that's happening in the movie, and the one I want to talk about first, because I think it's just so simple yet looks so good. And it just takes place in a very ordinary theater. There's nothing extravagant. There's no, at least I don't think there's any CGI, and there's no huge set decor or fancy location, yet the image just looks so well done and so beautiful. And there's a few techniques being used here that I kind of want to highlight. And the first one, and that happens throughout this film and many films, is creating points of interest. And they do this really well in this scene here, by the use of these two practicals in the back here. So obviously our eyes are kind of drawn to the main section here where all the priests are, but there's these very two small practicals kind of in the back that really help just create these points of interest in the scene. And this technique is done throughout the entire film, and it obviously this isn't anything new, but the reason why it also looks so good is because of the color contrast that it's also creating in this scene. And if you know anything about film, contrast is everything. Contrast really does help elevate your image. And the contrast obviously in the middle here is a very cyan, very kind of blue image. And then we have these practicals which are tungsten and set to a warmer tone. And that just helps create a color contrast between these 2 points in the reference of this frame. You'll also notice another set of contrast that's happening in terms of luminance, and that's the play of the highlights that are here and then the shadows that are here. And they're obviously using some sort of overhead light, which I'm assuming has a skirt on it to help control the spill and only focus our attention right into the center of where these priests are. In this very simple location, it just looks very visually compelling because of points of interest, color contrast, and luminance contrast. And obviously these are very simple techniques, but again, I kind of just wanted to highlight them in the beginning of this video, because this very simple technique is done throughout this entire film. But let's get into some of the other techniques that may not be so obvious, and that really help elevate the scenery and images in this movie. So the next scene I want to talk about is this one here. Now, of course, this is a very beautiful location, but the use of symmetry throughout this movie is really well done. And I absolutely love symmetry. I use it a lot in the films that I make and in the shoots that I have, because I really do think it's an easy way to make your image look just so visually compelling. So of course they have the use of these arches here that really help create this sense of symmetry and balance in the frame, and even something like having the statues placed on equal opposite sides of each other. And of course you have our main actor directly down the middle of the frame, which helps create this overall balance that you're trying to portray into our character here. So everything in most films is done with intention, and I think this shot really helps put some balance into our character, and also putting him into scale. And I'm going to talk about scale a little bit later and why it plays such an important role and something this film does really, really well. But again, we also, in this frame, have a sense of color contrast that's happening with the light at the top of the frame and the dark shadows at the bottom of the frame. So again, you're creating this sense of luminance contrast going from dark to light. And again, that just helps elevate the entire image. But the main point I wanted to point out in this frame was the use of symmetry, because it's not specifically related to just lighting, and it is another technique that you can use to make your images go from good to great. And again, here's another quick look at symmetry in the film. And again, it's done through and through. You're getting equal parts of kind of everything that's happening in the frame. And again, our subject right down the middle. So again, using symmetry, using them in different ways, parallel lines, it just makes your imagery look more visually compelling, than not having it. But, that's just one of the techniques I kind of wanted to highlight in this film that's being used, that's not just lighting, and why the cinematography has all these different techniques that really help elevate it. So one of the other techniques to really create a dynamic image is the use of reflections. And I noticed this film did that a lot. This was, a very low angle shot that was intentionally done to help create and view these reflections that are happening from these lights. So, you have this light here that's being reflected here. You have all of these lights that are being reflected here. And it really just helps make the shot more dynamic. And that's why you'll notice in most films, outside the floor is always wet, because it helps create this reflection. It helps create a more dynamic image. They do that in this film as well. And I'll show some more examples shortly here. But again, color contrast is also being used here. Of course, you have our warm tone, and then you have our cool tones as well. Same technique being used here with color contrast. But the reflections is really what I wanted to highlight, and you'll see it done here again. So again, you can see that, this floor was intentionally made wet to help create some more contrast and dynamicness into the actual shot. Of course, you see these police lights that are reflected down onto the floor. And again, just creating that dynamicness using reflections. So really, really well done. A really great way to elevate your image. Again, another technique being used here. And here's one more shot where, intentionally they put the camera low here to help signify the reflections that are happening in the floor. And it really just helps make the image pop a little bit more. And again, going back to one of the other techniques is the use of symmetry. So just really well done, in the ceiling here, the use of the windows here, and of course having our talents coming in this little triangle formation, that really just makes the image just feel very cohesive and made, it's just such an easy technique that you can just have in your pocket without having a big budget. Like you don't need a multi-million-dollar production to use symmetry, to use color contrast, to use reflections. And this is why I wanted to make this video, is to highlight some of these techniques that were used and were very apparent, at least to me, in this film. And I just think it was so beautiful and simple. But yeah, let's get into a couple more things I want to point out. Now, one of the things I really loved about this film is that it was able to make very ordinary locations look very visually compelling. So yes, most of the film does take place in this very beautiful cathedral type of building, but there was a lot of scenes that just happened in regular bedrooms and hallways and stairways that just looked really, really good. And they achieved that in a few ways. And one of the ways I want to talk about is this scene here that takes place in this very ordinary cafeteria. There's no extra or extravagant setup. It really is just a very ordinary looking cafeteria. But by using blocking, they were able to make this shot quite dynamic. So you have this person here in the foreground, and then you have these two characters in the background. And this really helps create a sense of separation to help highlight what's in focus here, and really create this 3D space in this 2D image. So again, like, you know, they didn't need to have these characters in the foreground and the background, but they add them in there to really help, again, create that 3D space and make the image that much better. So yeah, you know, they did this through this film. This is one of the examples I really wanted to highlight because it's taking place in a location that's very achievable for most filmmakers that don't have a multi-million-dollar budget. So really, really important is the use case of blocking. And this technique they use so many times, and I want to show you a couple more frames that I absolutely loved. Okay, so here's another shot or scene that used blocking to really help elevate the image. So they intentionally put, you know, these characters with the umbrellas in the foreground to really help elevate the image. You know, they didn't need to add these characters in, but again, it's creating this sense of perspective and depth that wouldn't really be there without. I'm sure the shot would have looked great without it because you're still getting this symmetry with the arches, and then the sense of scale, which I'm going to talk about next. Here's one more shot that again highlights blocking, where, you know, you're putting something in the foreground, you're putting something in the background to really highlight your mid-ground here. Again, that really, like, look how much depth is created by just doing this simple technique. It's just so beautiful, and this film did it so well. There's just so many things that I loved about this movie and why I wanted to talk about it. So there's, again, a few other techniques being used here. You have the sense of symmetry. Of course, that's happening. My line wasn't very symmetrical, sorry. So you have the sense of symmetry, and again, the same sort of blocking with the foreground, the midground, and then the background characters here as well. Okay, so the technique I want to talk about in this film, and it's used a lot, and I think this shot took place in the movie. I won't spoil anything, but after a very significant point in this movie, they used this technique, which is scale. So, you know, they use this great location, which has these massive pillars to make the characters feel smaller and put them into perspective, which I think is what I think they intended to do. But this film does it really, really well. So being able to use scale and perspective to put your characters into these locations or make them feel a certain way. And, you know, another movie that did that really well was Dune. Putting the characters into these locations and having all of these different types of machines and spaceships and locations that made them feel smaller, insignificant, or whatever in motion you're trying to invoke. But this movie did that really well. And so that's another technique that really helps elevate your images, is using scale. And this movie did that really, really well. And of course, the entire set decor, the clothing, the costume design, the props, like everything that was being used in this film was extremely well done. And again, it's not just about lighting. Your set decor and art department is very crucial to helping you elevate your films and bringing that level that really separates amateurs and professionals. So yeah. Obviously, you won't always have access to locations like this, but again, using all the techniques I just talked about is another way to really help push your images to the next level. Okay, so those are some of the techniques I wanted to touch on, and a few of the scenes I wanted to break down, because after I watched this movie, I just knew I wanted to talk about it, because it doesn't always come down to lighting. Yes, lighting is very important to make your images look good, but there's so many other techniques that can be used to really help elevate your image. And one last thing I kind of want to talk about is this image here, because this image really doesn't have to do with lighting. This image has to do with the production design, the art design, the costume design, So, you know, when you're creating your films, don't always just think in terms of how can I best light this. You know, sometimes there's so much more and ways that you can tell your story, you know, and using techniques like blocking, reflections, symmetry, whatever else it might be, you know, it can make your films or your shoots go from good to great. So if you enjoyed watching this video, let me know. I'm happy to do some more breakdowns in the future. But this is just something I wanted to highlight after watching the movie because I was just blown away with the entire cinematography of the movie. Okay, thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you guys on the next one.